So we're seeing a couple people come in, trickling in. Welcome everyone. This is our first webinar on professional growth series. We are so excited that you joined us today. We have the pleasure of having Erin Woods and Lauren Knapp from DeVry University. Thank you guys so much for being here. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started with the presentation with the webinar. Just a couple of reminders that the chat is free to use for everyone. So if you have questions or would like to comment anything, please feel free to use the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll go ahead and have some time for Q&A. So you can go ahead and start racking up those questions in there or save your questions for later. The other thing is we will be recording and sending out the webinar and the presentation in our post-event email. So feel free to be on the lookout for that. And yeah, that's all for now. So we're going to go ahead and have Laura and Erin get started. Thank you guys so much.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Saria, Ascend Phoenix, and everyone joining us this morning for our session on managing through change. My name is Erin Woods, and I am one of your presenters this morning. And joining me is Laura Knapp from our Long Beach, California campus. And we are both deans of campus deans of campus and university partnerships, and are super excited about kicking the series off this morning with Ascend Phoenix. There's also management and leadership theories and behaviors that best support managing teams through change. We have all experienced great change personally and organizationally over the last year with the pandemic. For that reason, we want to make this session as engaging and interpersonal as possible. So as we go through the session, please feel free to unmute yourselves, raise your hands, or engage via chat, because we want to hear from you about your experiences and thoughts about change. Change is inevitable. The discussion today revolves around how we as leaders manage change, and as peers, how do we support each other through that change? And I want to ask a quick question for you to think about before we get started. How many of you consider yourselves consistently comfortable with change? And what makes change so comfortable for you? And then on the other hand, how many of you find yourselves a bit apprehensive about change initially? And why do you think you're initially hesitant when you think about change, or you're presented with something that's going to change in your personal environment? We address this throughout this webinar, and we encourage self-reflection as you think about the different phases of change. So with that being said, we'll just jump right in. It's important to be self-aware and understand your own tendencies, correct? Just like Jack Walsh said, before you are a leader, success is about growing yourself. When you become a leader, success is all about growing others. I mentioned that we want to go on a journey of self-reflection. Sometimes we perceive ourselves as leaders to be effective change agents, but would our teams and peers co-sign on that idea? Chances are your team, the people you will lead through transitions and transformations, all feel very differently about change and how they expect you to lead them through change. And yet, no matter what they think, it's up to you as a leader to motivate, support, and lead your team from point A to point B, trying to avoid as many roadblocks as possible and making your team as comfortable as possible. Today, we'll look at several key areas of change management. First and foremost, what is change management? What are some of the barriers to change? We'll explore these barriers and discuss how to lead through the different phases of change. We have change leadership. Here we will identify the qualities of an effective change leader. We'll also talk about the phases of change and how to not only recognize those phases, but the strategies to employ at each phase. I can't reinforce enough today, but this workshop is all about you. So your participation, your experiences, and your personal best practices will enhance everyone's experience today. So please share as much as possible. Moving along, in the business world, there are two types of change: organizational transitions, and people transitions. I mentioned this a while back when we stated how we all have experienced organizational and personal changes over the last year. A successful change leader realizes that one affects the other, and the ideal management of change occurs when both transitions overlap. Some organizational transitions consist of new processes or procedures being put in place, departments merging or taking on new responsibilities, company that you work for has landed a new piece of business, or for example, our transition from working in a building to now all working from home. Some of the people transitions include people being added or removed from your team, promotions or layoffs, a new boss. Can you all think of any other examples from the organizational or people side of the transition?
Promotions, right? Title changes.
Title changes is another one. Well, no matter the type of change, at the end of the day, change impacts people. And so what is change management? It's the process, tools, and techniques to manage the people side of change to achieve the required business outcomes. Now, Laura will review some of the barriers to change.
Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you for defining what change management is. It really is a process, and the approach, the tools, the procedures that individuals and teams and organizations use in order to affect change and in order to have the outcomes, right, that the organization needs. And so behind any change, you know, they say change is for the better, right? Behind any change, there's always a positive reason for it, you know, whether we're going to, you know, do more good in the community or educate more students or, you know, have leaner operations, right? Or maybe reduce risk in certain areas. Even with a pandemic, that was, you know, I wouldn't categorize a pandemic as a good thing, but organizations were forced to put into place change initiatives that, you know, increase safety, increase public safety, and allowed operations to continue. So that change, if you look at it that way, was a very good thing. We had to do it. It was a very good thing. So change is good, right? Change is good. Then why, I guess my question is, why are there so many barriers sometimes? Why do we encounter challenges to change as leaders of our organizations or at our organizations, as leaders of teams, you know, even as individual contributors? We see barriers sometimes out there. So this is a laundry list of some of the most common barriers to change. And I think it really boils down to probably just not enough knowledge, not enough understanding of the change itself, which of course boils down to communication or lack of communication. I went ahead and put in the chat, I love change. You know, change can be energizing. Change is something new. I think we as human beings are hardwired to accept and want, you know, certain types of change. But me, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, I do want to know about the change and its impact. Okay, I kind of want to be able to process it and think it through. And if I don't have enough information, and sometimes you'll see this in the organization, not enough information or not enough quality information, or maybe somebody missed the meeting. And so that information needs to be repeated, right? It needs to be over communicated. So not enough understanding of the change itself. Some people will point to lack of leadership, and maybe it's true. Maybe the leader hasn't taken the time or hasn't really invested the time or taken the responsibility to communicate and to own this change and to get behind it. Okay, that sometimes does happen. You'll see that. You know, we don't want to be that person. As leaders of teams and organizations and departments, and even, you know, leading ourselves, we want to always exhibit that leadership, that strength, own, you know, what we're working on. Sometimes leaders will point to the project management team and say, well, the project management team, we got a great team in place, but for whatever reason, they're just not focused. It's not happening. And then you'll talk to the project managers, right? And they'll say, you know, I don't have the buy-in that I need, that we need from this key stakeholders or from the executive team or from, our sales team or whoever those key stakeholders are. We don't have that buy-in, so we're not able to go at full momentum, full speed ahead. So anyway, there's so many reasons. Sometimes the beginning and the ending of the change initiative is not clear. You're all excited about a change that's coming down the pike, that's going to begin next fiscal year, and your understanding is it's next fiscal year, but then you're told, no, it's actually immediate, the change that we should be seeing and expecting and acting on. So sometimes there's a lack of clarity, which again, it goes back to the communication piece, I believe. Sometimes we don't know. Simply, people's barriers to change are not defined. We don't know sometimes what those barriers are. Why? Because we haven't asked. Again, that's communication. And once in a while, you'll see projects that are shelved, and deemed not successful. But they were successful. They had a lot of successes. There are a lot of great outcomes, but the data wasn't being captured in order to be recognized. Those successes were not being recognized, and the progress was not being measured adequately. So this sometimes happens too, where you're like, this is a great project. We've accomplished so much. And at the end of the day, the executives or, the key stakeholders are like, yeah, no, it really didn't. And so, that's disappointing as well. So there's a lot of, very common barriers to change. I guess I would love to hear from the audience at this point. What would you say are the most significant barriers or challenges that you've seen over time at your organizations? And it could be where you're working now, it could be a prior role, or it could be even with any nonprofit work that you may be doing, any volunteer work. Change. Where have you seen change, and where have you seen barriers coming from? What have been the challenges? I'm going to take a minute,
Okay.
have a sip of my tea, because I'd love to see, either take yourselves off mute if you're on mute, or feel free to fill us in via chat on what you would deem the biggest barrier or barriers to change.
So Laura, this is Saria. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think one of the biggest barriers is when change is happening rapidly. So this for COVID-19, change was happening every day. So, how do you get used to change, when you have change and it's happening in a slower pace, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could probably deal with it, but when it's happening like on an everyday kind of thing, it's like, nothing is, I come to work, they tell me to do this, I come to work tomorrow and they're telling me to do something different with the same process. So.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. It's almost change fatigue starts to set in, where it's like, every day something new, something different. And it's almost, wow, it can be, I don't know what the word is, discombobulating or confusing in a way, and that can lead to a little bit of a lack of productivity, because you're thinking, well, what is today going to bring? Come on, every day or twice a day, we're getting these new mandates and new initiatives. Oh my gosh, maybe I'm going to just put a pause on what I'm doing until the next mandate comes down, right? So it can be distracting, it can be a bit confusing, and it can have an impact on productivity. So I'm just looking at the chat here. Okay, yep. We agree with you. And okay, yeah, politics, definitely. Change in leadership, that's a real challenge. State leadership is changing. There's nothing we can do per se. We can't control that. That's not something we can control as change leaders. So the idea is really just to get a very good sense of timing and of what those politics are, right? In order to hopefully get through or get around that change. Yet the unknown. And for me, I like to know everything. And sometimes I feel like maybe I come off as, wanting too much detail. But for me, it's about just having a clear sense of what's next and what needs to be done. And it's almost like the more I know, the better I can move forward and at a better pace, a better speed. The more I know about the change and what's happening in real time. And I get that things change on a daily basis, but the more I know, the quicker I know, the better information I have, right? The faster I can go as a human being. And I would say that's probably common. It's probably not just me. I think the more we know, it's like the better we feel about, because The thing is, you'll put a pause on your actions if you're not sure. When people are confused or they feel like they don't have all the pieces of information, they're going to put a pause. They're going to say, well, I'm going to call it a day. Let's see what tomorrow brings. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Switching from in classroom to online, a blessing. Yeah, pros and cons, but a blessing in disguise. But at the beginning, it's like, oh my gosh, we have to get everybody up to speed on this technology. We got to make sure that people are logging in on time. And, we have to see how we can avoid any of those technical difficulties, right? But then at the end of the day, you're able to connect with more students in their everyday lives. So lots of pros, lots of positive actually coming from the change that was a reaction to the pandemic, right, that we're seeing. So let's keep on moving on. I want to talk about a little bit about our next slide, which you're going to see a curve, right?
Oh, we're doing that one. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, the curve.
Oh, I have gone too far.
Yeah, as we talked about the common barriers to change, kind of the biggest barriers that people see out there. There's so many, so many barriers. And this is not to really focus on, what's wrong or what's challenging, but I think it is important to understand what those barriers are and what their root causes are. Why? So we can lead through them and so that we can get ahead of them and really lead our teams through this phase of change, okay, or lead ourselves through this phase of change. Okay, so the more we know about what the common barriers are, the more we can predict them. The more we can understand what's causing them and the more we can get through them and around them and lead our teams. Now, what we're looking at here, this slide with a curve, this was written about quite extensively by management guru and consultant William Bridges, and he wrote a book called Change Transition, or Transitioning Through Change. Okay, so he is a consultant around change management, and he writes a lot about this productivity curve or this change curve that you're going to see with any change. And again, I said change is good, right? Change is always good. Yet you're going to see this U-shaped curve. There's always going to be some sort of dip in productivity when that change is launched. Okay, so as change leaders, right, all of us, we want to lead that change. Our goal is to be in the green by actively managing that change, by actively communicating what the change is and how it's going to affect people, by actively staying in touch and listening, right, to our teammates and the people that we lead, by basically implementing the tools and procedures and approaches that change management, is. We want to tighten the curve. Okay, we don't want to be on this red lower, where productivity really dips. This is productivity where a change initiative is not being actively managed or managed well. Okay, where there is, confusion abounding, where people are not exactly sure what's next, where the leadership is not in place. Okay, people can slip into really counterproductive activities. Okay, if they don't know enough about the change or they don't have the tools themselves to, to keep moving forward. Does that make sense? So there is going to be a productivity drop, but the more actively we manage the change, the sooner we return to equilibrium. You'll see that's a second dot along the timeline. We get to equilibrium, or where we were before the change in terms of productivity. And the sooner we can actually reap the benefits or, the rewards of the change initiative that was put in place, which gives us a higher ROI over the lifetime of this change initiative. Whereas if it's not being actively managed or it's being poorly managed, we return to equilibrium at a slower pace, right? And we may not even achieve all of those outcomes that were predicted or that were planned or that were hoped for. Okay, so that is the change curve. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a bit about the phases of change. Erin?
Thanks, Laura. Now I want you to think about a time when you were part of a successful change initiative. There have been a couple of examples in the chat so far, but what did the key leaders demonstrate that made your change or transition go smoothly? In your experience, what kinds of behaviors do successful change leaders exhibit? I know for me personally, I look for competence and confidence. from my change leaders in order for me to get want to buy in on whatever that change is that's being implemented. Any other input from you all on what your experiences have been with successful change leaders? Yes, actually listening. And some organizations have gone and tried to make sure they include the individuals that are going to be responsible for implementing that change during the planning of whatever those changes are going to be. Transparency and clarity, explaining, yes. And those are all great points that we're going to hit on actually next. Emotional intelligence, or the ability to understand that people have varied reactions to change, like fear, resentment, excitement, and so on, are key. Great change leaders use empathy to fully appreciate another person's experience of change and try not to judge it. They are curious and have the ability to probe for understanding and meaning, as you all mentioned, listening, actively listening. They have the willingness to adapt their style and approach based on the situation and the needs of the team and or organization. They know how to learn from every situation and are willing to try new things and appropriately balance risk and reward. Getting the commitment from team members can be one of the most difficult elements of change leadership. And that's why, as a change leader, you must be in tune with your team as individuals. I may not process change the same way Laura does. So our change leader should be willing to sit with us individually and understand how change affects us and determine the best way to manage us through the process. And this brings us to the next question. How do people experience change? Please feel free to chime in here with your personal experiences with change. I know, like I said, with the pandemic, we've all had to immediately shift from an office environment to working from home. If you have family at home, making those transitions to accommodating, the students learning from home. You had childcare and that shut down, and how are you doing that? And everyone's in the house together. How did that affect you, and how did you experience it? Right. We were kind of forced to adapt. Thank you for that input. According to the Bridges model that Laura went over earlier, everyone does react differently. Resistance is normal, but it's not always logical. Adjustment to change takes time. And change requires individual energy as well as risk and emotional investments. To your point, how does it affect you personally? Getting that buy-in early so that I'm not so resistant to whatever this change is that's being implemented. Where are my slides? Okay. With change management, the goal is to not change people or find a miraculous way to make them love whatever change occurred, but that we help support them as they reorient themselves to the change that is happening to and around them. The transition is often a series of very subtle personal adjustments. For example, think of the adjustments required when asked to work with a new team with new personalities. Externally, the team changes, but internally, a shift happens while learning the best ways to connect with new personalities. The language that needs to be used, norms of behavior, and culture may need to subtly shift. Our goal is to help support and encourage our teams to successfully make these adjustments as we walk together through the process of change. Now, is everyone still following along? Because we want to answer any questions you may have right now before Laura goes into the different phases of change. Just checking the chat really quickly. Again, all very good points. But I will now pass it back over to Laura.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks so much, Erin. Yes, so let's talk about the phases. There are 3 distinct phases of change. Again, we have our U-shaped curve according to William Bridges, and he categorizes change, or he divides it into these 3 phases. And at the beginning, he calls the beginning of any change the end. Why? Because it's the end of the former state. Okay, so when we all went home and the pandemic hitting, basically that was the end of that former state. And when we go back, or as we're going back, I think we're noticing that we're not going back per se. We're moving forward in a different way. Okay, leveraging technology in a different way. And a lot of people are going back to work in a hybrid modality. Students are studying in the hybrid modality, right? And we're integrating a lot that, a lot of the innovations that we came up with during that change. So let's just say the beginning of change is really the end of the former. And then we go through a transition phase. And then if we successfully transition, or we're able to transition, we are in the new beginnings phase where the change has been adopted, it's been assimilated, productivity is up again. And helping people transition, Erin talked about, how can we help people transition? And there's a lot of good content and comments here in the chat as well. How can we help them? The natural psychological reactions that people tend to have, and this is big picture, going through these phases, starts with uncertainty. Okay, uncertainty about the change. I don't know enough. I'm uncertain. And even like me, I'm excited by change, but I'm uncertain, what's next? What's happening? Unfortunately, it's followed by skepticism. And this is where the productivity tends to drop to its lowest point, because people are seeing maybe what's putting in place and they're questioning, they're skeptical, they're not sure if it's going to be successful. You start hearing from people, well, we'll see. We'll see how this goes. We'll see how it works. Okay, so skepticism during that transition, the beginning of the transition phase, but it transitions into then, if things are being managed well, into an exploratory phase where people generally start to explore this new change. They start to get excited about the opportunities that potentially are there. Okay, and that was me, having to, go work from home. At first, it was like, wow, excitement, but I'm not sure how this is going to work. Is it going to work? And then you start to explore, what can I fit into my life? How can I be more productive and layer in different and new activities into this new way of, doing work? Okay, and then finally, it's commitment. Finally, it's commitment. And that's where we start to reap the rewards of our change initiative, where everybody has gotten so used to the change, they understand it, they accept it, they're benefiting from it, hopefully, and they're committed to it, right? And we're now in the new beginning stage, the new era. Okay, so our role is to help people navigate through these 3 phases. And so we'll go to the next slide. Yep, okay. So yeah, we'll focus on this slide now. The phases of change, the ending, the beginning of change really is the ending of a former way of being, doing business, working with people. You fill in the blanks. This is where productivity begins to dip. This is actually, I did want to say, this is a challenging time, or can be a challenging time for leaders. Why? Because if you are leading a team, maybe, and let's talk about a different kind of change initiative, a new platform is being put in place, or there's a restructure, or there's a new product being launched, right? A new way of doing business. You as the leader have been clued in to a certain extent on what this change entails. And so when you bring it to your team, they still need time, right, to process that change and to understand it and to ask questions. But because we know more about the change, if we don't check ourselves, if we're not self-aware, we may come off as impatient, or we may start feeling impatient with all the questions. We're like, oh my gosh, this is so straightforward. This is so easy. What's the challenge? But people, you have to remember, people are seeing this, for the first time. So you got to give them time. Okay. Definitely got to provide time and be patient. Productivity begins to drop. This also makes managers nervous, right? If they're starting to see fewer, whatever it is, that you do in your community. If you're a teacher, right? Maybe, oh my gosh, students' performance is starting to dip. This is where we start to get nervous. We're like, no, 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 no. Let's get back on track. How can we get back on track? Okay, so all of this is to say it's important to be self-aware and understand what these phases are so we can check ourselves and our own, kind of modes of being, that panic, if we're feeling panicked or stressed or frustrated, irritated, lack of patience. We want to keep an eye on that, okay, during this phase. Okay, so I'm going to go to, yes, this next slide. What we're going to see during this first phase is, well, some people may view the change as a loss or a gain, right? There may be intellectual understanding, but still not emotional acceptance. You'll know this is happening when you hear people saying, no, I get it. I understand why we're doing this, but why now? Or why this way? How come they're not doing it that way? So you'll hear it through the questioning. It's characterized or can be characterized by a reluctance to let go of the older ways. People still wanting to go into the classroom per se, if you're a teacher. Why are we having to go online and do Zoom and everything else? Okay, so a reluctance. Leaders can perceive this lack of readiness as resistance. As I mentioned just a minute ago, we can be perceiving this reluctance as resistance. It's not really resistance per se. It's just sort of a lack of information. We need to fill that gap and, answer the questions and listen to the concerns so that we can truly get people back on track, back on that curve that's hopefully, someday soon going upwards, where we're picking up speed, we're picking up momentum in the right direction, and we're picking up productivity. So it is any sort of perceived resistance or reluctance, any of the bullets you see on this slide are very much a natural part of the transition process. So I always say, strap, put on your seatbelt and just be ready for it, right? Just be ready for that question, the questions that are coming through, the questioning and the perceived resistance, okay? And you're going to see positive behaviors. Absolutely. You're going to see positive, and I don't want to say negative, but you're going to see different behaviors. On the positive side, you're going to know you're in this beginning, this phase, this ending phase, I guess we should be calling it. When you see excitement, you may see some anxiety as well, but you're going to have those people like myself. I'm like, I love change, right? Something different. It's energizing. Okay. So you may see increased involvement. Okay. You may see team members really amping it up, in terms of their involvement and their energy levels. They're asking questions, they want more information, and they're acknowledging, they're saying, yeah, I know we need to absolutely go to, all online for, for people's health and safety, right? So those are the positive behaviors that you're going to see, and you're going to want to, as much as you can, amplify those positive behaviors, encourage them. Now, on the negative side, or I guess the less constructive side, you may see anger. Erin referred to anger. It's almost like the stages of grief, right? Where you're going to see anger over loss, bargaining to avoid change. Oh my gosh, if I do this, can we not have this change? Okay, those kind of conversations may come up. Denial, denial that the change is happening or should be happening. And you may see decreased involvement. Okay, so people just kind of disengaging a little bit, throughout this phase. Okay.
Yes, all good points, Laura. And feeling about losses, vary from person to person. As a leader, there's a power in recognizing and acknowledging the losses that come with the end of an era. Some losses individual may feel are attachments. Someone mentioned in the chat earlier that, they miss being able to connect with colleagues that they were in the office with. Influence, areas of responsibility, status, identity. Someone mentioned earlier about changing the title that you may have. If you previously identified with one role and then they change your title, you want to know what type of influence do you now have within the organization and amongst your peers. Structure, we've all had to change where we were working. That can be considered a loss. And then just an overall meaning of, what does your organization stand for? Who am I now representing now that this change has occurred? Unfortunately, we have 4 in-phase strategies, and they all have one common theme: communication. We've been mentioning that, or that buzzword has continued to come up throughout this entire presentation, but communication definitely is key. The number 1 strategy that we suggest is committing to frequent communication. Reserve agenda time in your regular team meetings to discuss what has changed and how people are adjusting, what's working and what isn't. Quantity counts when it's meaningful. Strategy number 2 is to execute clear, consistent, and transparent communication. Be clear about what is changing. Ineffective communication has no space in managing change. It may create more problems than warranted. If you don't have the answers to a question, seek the answer for your team and be sure to follow up. We want quality, honest, and transparent communication. Strategy number 3, someone mentioned it earlier about actively listening. Listen to your team's concerns and practice active listening. Communicate clearly and often, but then leave room for listening. This is one that hits home for me because I'm sure someone has been in a meeting at some point where changes were being announced, and you have that one leader or a peer that is so determined to talk or speak that they end up asking a question that was answered, but they missed it because they weren't actively listening. We all know that person, but the point is to genuinely hear others so that you understand how things are affecting them. And finally, ending phase strategy number 4. You've been listening. Make sure you're listening for understanding. What are you doing with that understanding? How has what you've learned going to positively affect you and how you engage with your team and support them through change? And think about how much they will appreciate actually being heard. Now, Laura will move us into the transition phase of change.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erin. So now we've successfully navigated through the ending phase, essentially with thorough, transparent, two-way communication, as Erin was pointing out. So next comes the transition phase. This is challenging in its own way, the transition phase. And I guess, can anyone guess the biggest challenge for leaders during this phase? Anybody have any ideas? I'll take a look at the chat here, or feel free to take yourselves off mute. What's the challenge during this transitional phase where we're moving from skepticism to exploration, right? On the one hand, we're feeling good to be moving forward into something new, right? Buy-in. Yeah, buy-in can still be a challenge. Hearing that skepticism, fear of failure. Lots of different, sort of different emotions, fear of failure, challenges may be coming up, right? What do they say about the best laid plans, right? We have this wonderful plan in place, and maybe there are challenges that we have to pivot away from. I think one of the biggest challenges of this transition phase is it's the productivity curve. This is where productivity is at its lowest. So as a leader, even as an individual, contributor, this is where it's a very uncomfortable space to be in. I mean, it's a positive phase, right? We're moving forward, but the stress is on because we see, and again, if, I'm using the teacher example, we see maybe the students' grades dipping or their output is really dipping, okay? So we're starting to feel that stress. The good news is during the transition phase, we should see that productivity picking up eventually, right? And so that's why we call it a transition phase. We're going to dip low, and then we're going to start, climbing back up out of this dip of productivity. Okay. So yeah, accommodating those who would like to still work at home versus in the office. Do we give this option to any future new hires? I think, the jury may still be out on this. And we just even had a conversation, Erin and myself, just earlier today. But I think a lot of organizations will be offering perhaps the hybrid mode, Or maybe we see, kind of an at-site work culture that's really attractive enough, to incentivize folks to come back. And maybe it's the opposite. Maybe, I think some organizations are going to say, we're all going to work from home indefinitely or work remotely indefinitely. So I think it's going to run the gamut, and we'll probably, cater to or depend on the culture and also the type of industry, right, that we're talking about, and even maybe the region or the state, that you're operating in. So it's going to be very interesting to see. But that is, something that we have to, as leaders, figure out. That is a tough one to figure out. Moving along in the transition phase, okay, what you're going to see on the positive side, you'll know you're in the transition phase when you start to see people really exploring and looking forward to, new opportunities. They continue to ask questions, right? They're still gathering kind of more information, right? They want to know more. And there's a growing sense of opportunity, and again, I kind of alluded to it, where they're thinking, gosh, maybe this is, going to be really good. I think, when I transitioned to work remotely, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so different. And it took a minute for me to realize, I'm actually able to be as productive, if not more productive, with work, and also balance, certain other things into my work. In fact, I think I got a little bit busier on the work side, but that's okay, because I was able to, sort of weave in other things that allowed me to kind of stay ahead on other personal and family fronts. So I had this sense of opportunity. And with any change, whether it's, you're putting in a new software system, oh my gosh, you're coming up with a new product or a new class, this growing sense of opportunity, like this is going to be good. Okay, this is going to be good. That's the positive, reactions and that you're going to see during this transitional phase. However, unfortunately, you may still be experiencing some of the less constructive behaviors at work. You may sense a covert or even overt resistance, right? Or almost that passive aggressiveness, like, well, because you're putting this change in, I wasn't able to. So if you're sensing that resistance, it's probably because there's still some open questions that haven't been resolved, as you go through this transitional phase. Okay. So we're beyond uncertainty, but there may be skepticism still. People may be less involved. I think I mentioned that lack of involvement. People may be acting differently than you remember them. And this, I think, mental health became, a big thing to think about and be aware about during the pandemic time, when it was like, oh my gosh, from one day to the next, people went home, and some people's maybe mental health suffered for it. So depression, do you see people acting differently or being a lot less engaged? You want to keep an eye on that as a leader. As a leader, you want to just definitely keep an eye on that. Okay. Sabotage, aggression. This can happen too. I don't know if any of you are leaders and have experienced this. Unfortunately, it can happen when somebody is just like so opposed still to the change that they want to make it look bad, right? Or maybe they want to make a teammate look bad, and say, see, the change is not worth it. Unfortunately, this sometimes happens. It's rare, but I think as leaders, we just want to be clear-eyed and ready, again, for everything. Inconsistent productivity. Overall, we're sort of at that dip phase where productivity is, on that downward, but we're also seeing it track back up. If we have been successful in leading people through this transition, it should be tracking back up too. So, and again, we only bring up these challenging behaviors so that you can be ahead of them, okay? So that you can see them coming, so that you can understand the root causes. And I like to say that really the root cause is usually just lack of information. So good, clear, firm, confident communication and spelling things out is always, going to be needed, right? Always going to be very, very useful. Moving right along, okay? We have to recognize, and I think this is an important thing to think about during this transitional phase and during all of the phases of change. People are feeling possibly at a loss. Okay. So we have to get people through, this transition zone by, in a sense, restoring where they feel they've lost control, they've lost understanding, right? They used to know their jobs 100%. They were, knew every in and out, and now the job has changed, perhaps, or their role has changed. Okay, they're working with new teammates, perhaps. Again, so many different types of change, and so there's a lack of understanding, or understanding is lost. They may feel a lack of support. Okay, they may feel a lack of support by their leader, by their organization, by their team. So we want to restore. We want to make sure that our teammates understand that they are supported by the organization. Show them how, and show them through action, right? Sometimes we tell people by saying, and I think, more beneficial is to show people through doing. And then also purpose. We may have, and I think Aaron alluded to it, was talking about, we've lost our purpose, our meaning, right? If our job role has changed, or we're in a new team. Now we're on marketing, in marketing. We used to be in operations. Okay, how can we help restore that meaning, that purpose to the people that report to us? Okay, I mean, basically, you'll need to underline that they do have an important purpose, even if it is different. A really key thing to do during this phase, during this transitional phase, is to capitalize on creativity, because this is where you're going to see a lot of new creativity coming out. Okay, everything is in, kind of in flux. All right, and so you're going to see people brainstorming, people innovating, people thinking, oh my gosh, well, now that we're doing, going through this change, could we also do X, Y, Z? And I would say, absolutely, you're not going to want to discount at all people's creativity during this phase. Capitalize on it, encourage it. Okay, don't discount it and say, oh yeah, interesting thought, let's talk about that later. Capitalize on the creativity. Who knows? Your people may be coming up with really good ideas that are going to help you continue, into your new beginning phase. It's also important during transition. I'll just talk about self-reflection, right? As a leader, we want to be reflective and kind of check in with ourselves. I'll go back to the prior slide, if you don't mind, Aaron. Kind of think about, how are we doing? Do we, are we good still with the change? Are we understanding it? We're going to want to continue to listen to our teammates, but we're going to want to model what we want to see by just being very self-aware. And if we feel like we need to talk with a friend or a mentor, right, or a stakeholder or one of our executives, now would be the time to do that check-in and just make sure that we are still on track so that we can continue to lead. Let's continue to share information regularly, and let's definitely celebrate quick wins. And then if you've been, next slide is fine, if you've been successful helping your team transition through this phase, the good news is you're going to find yourself, this is where you start feeling better, because you're going to see the momentum progressing. You're going to see productivity picking up once again as you move up the change curve into your new beginnings phase. Aaron, you want to take it from here?
I sure will. So how do you know you've gotten to the new beginnings phase? You'll have a sense that you're close when you start seeing increased teamwork and cooperation, propensity to learn new skills, settling into new routines, the positive regard for change, and then the increased input and productivity, which we've been monitoring throughout this entire change phase. What is your productivity looking like? When are you coming out of the dip and it is starting to look positive and efficient again? That said, there will still be some negatives, even with new beginnings. But we can help alleviate some of those negatives by leading the way through celebrating beginnings, clarifying the roles and responsibilities. Again, communication is very, 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 very key. Feeling unsure about the future, being nervous, more responsibilities, you're working at a faster pace. And again, how does this change really affect me? And I started to hint on these earlier, but in managing those negative behaviors, again, celebrating those wins, giving clear direction, acknowledging and rewarding frequently, over communicating, and consider how the change integrates into other areas. What other departments are being affected? Take the time here to mentor and coach. Your employees want to feel they are continuously learning and growing, especially during challenging times. But most importantly, this is the opportunity for you to be a role model and continue to model what you want to see. Modeling the behavior you want to see is always important, especially during times of constant change. And you know, now to use this model of change or transition management, no matter what the changes you're facing at your organization or in your personal lives. I'm curious as to which phase of change that we've gone over today, ending, transition, or new beginning, that you all as leaders may feel is the most difficult. I agree with you, Saria. The transition phase can be the most difficult, and understanding where you foresee the most difficulty for your team through change is a benefit. And as you get ready to go through the change management process, you know where you're going to have to spend most of your time and where you're going to have to provide the most resources. As we wrap up, I did want to make a quick shout out regarding DeVry and Keller Graduate School of Management certificates and degree programs in technology, business, and healthcare administration. If anyone is interested in learning more, please connect with me or Laura later on. Our contact information is going to be on the next slide. But DeVry is a yellow ribbon school, and we accept the Montgomery GI Bill and post 9/11 GI Bill, and we offer special rates for active duty military. This actually concludes our presentation, and I want to thank you all so much for your time this morning. Like I said, our contact information is provided here for your reference, but we hope that this information has been helpful for you and that you've learned something about change management that you can take back to your organizations. We look forward to having you all join us on June 16th as we discuss resolving workplace conflict. And now I want to open it up for any questions or comments anyone may have.
Thank you so much, ladies. That's such helpful information. And man, as we were just talking about, you know, everything that change brings, I'm just like reminded how helpful this is, because we've been in one of the most fast changing years in a really long time. So this is beyond applicable, beyond helpful. So thank you so much. Yeah, let's give a couple minutes and see if anybody has any other questions. I know the chat was moving pretty well. So I think we hit most things. But yeah, if anybody would like to unmute or has any comments or questions, feel free to do that right now as we have a few more minutes.
Yeah, feel free to take yourselves off mute. Let us know what questions you still have. I know Lily did have a question about accommodating those who would still like to work at home versus in the office. I'm just wondering if anybody in the audience, right, would like to comment on that as well, or if there's anything that you all are doing or have seen being done to sort of help with that accommodation or help with that shift. I don't want to say back to it's a new normal, right? It's a shift as organizations consider opening up their doors and getting, you know, some semblance of operations going back on site. How are you all addressing this change? Any ideas for Lily?
I just think that hybrid is the way of the future. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think Erin was saying this yesterday, you know, people may be expecting to go back to the way it was, the way things were. And again, it's not. We're not going back. You know, we're moving forward with new ways of doing things and new technologies, you know, huge increase in the leveraging of technology to stay productive, you know, over the past year and a half. And so that technology is not going to go away, right? Those ways of meeting, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, everything else, people working from a laptop. And so it'll be interesting to see. And again, I think it's going to depend on, the various industries and so forth. But I think we are probably looking forward to some sort of hybrid mode, in the future.
Yeah, this is Saria. I would challenge, business owners to ask, why are you, do you want people to come back into the office? Right? There's some positions where, yes, it might be a better fit to be in the office. But there's, some positions that may not, that you can actually work from home. So I will ask the question, why? Why is it that you need employees in the office? And do the pros and cons of it and see, if a hybrid, would be worth it, or a complete, work from home model is good for you. So, asking the why would, in brainstorming and understanding, your whole business model, I think will help answer that question. I don't know.
That's exactly.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And then, think about the cost savings on travel alone. I don't know if anyone actually has stopped to think about what are you saving and not paying mileage, or for those positions that, we have some positions within DeVry where they report to our home office in Naperville, but they live here on the West Coast. So all of that travel back and forth has all been prevented. That's an additional cost savings.
Yeah. And then also, I think you can get better talent. If you're in Arizona, if I want to hire someone in Miami, I know that's a perfect fit. Why can't I? So it just kind of opens you up more to not just the talent in your state, but talent anywhere, whether it's the United States or someone overseas. I don't know.
See, you're brainstorming right now.
Exactly.
This is like, we must be going through, we must be in some sort of transition phase. I think we are, right, with the thought about going back, or, somehow changing and coming back. And it's important to brainstorm and see, what are the pros and cons? What are the opportunities that we can take advantage of?
Yeah. Again, thank you guys so much. This is so helpful and so, like I said, beyond applicable given the year that we've gone through and that we continue to go through. Since we don't have any other questions, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. But like I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to share your contact information and the presentation, as well as the recording, in our post-event email. So please be on the lookout for that. And just for all the members in the audience, feel free to use that contact information to reach out to Erin and Laura if you guys would like any post-event conversations. And we look forward to our next webinar on the 16th. That's going to be some super helpful stuff as well on resolving workplace conflicts. So again, thank you so much, ladies, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You all do the same. See you in